All right, thank you so much for being with us. Um, can you start by telling us, who you are and how you came to Ayurveda?
Sure. My name's Diana Lurie. I'm a professor of neuropharmacology at the University of Montana, and I am a neuroscientist, and I've spent most of my career studying nervous system injury and how the nervous system recovers from injury. And I came to Ayurveda in kind of an interesting way about 8 or 9 years ago. I had reached kind of a dead end in my research. And I wasn't quite sure what direction to go in. And I thought, well, maybe there is something about how we view the body that we're just missing in Western medicine. When I was a graduate student in the 1980s, I studied spinal cord regeneration. There was a lot of excitement in the field because everybody thought we were going to solve spinal cord regeneration in the next 5 or 10 years. Well, here we are in 2018, and we still haven't done that. So I was kind of thinking about, well, what other ways can we look at physiology and the body? And at the time I was getting a yoga magazine and I was flipping through it, and I looked at the back and there was an advertisement for Ayurveda training. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. I wonder what Ayurveda is. And so when I did some research and looked it up, I realized that the basis for Ayurveda in terms of human health was based on the doshas. And that really is a genetic underpinning to Ayurveda. So Ayurveda calls it doshas, but it's really our genetic predisposition. So that appealed to me as a scientist. And so I trained with Kerala Ayurveda and spent some time in India. And I actually use Ayurveda a lot now. It's really driven sort of the direction of my biomedical research. So I'm trained as an Ayurvedic practitioner, but I'm also a scientific researcher and a teacher.
So I think that this is really exciting, this idea that the doshas relate to your genetic predisposition. Could you speak more about that? I think that's something people don't talk a lot about and haven't heard much about.
Yeah, well, actually that's entering into our conversation more and more when we talk about personalized medicine. Mm-hmm. And so I teach in a school of pharmacy, and one of the really emerging areas in pharmacy is how everybody is a little bit different in terms of the enzymes that they use for drug metabolism. So in the future, in the not too distant future, when a physician orders you a prescription or a drug for you, you might have a genetic test to determine, well, what are the enzymes that are used to metabolize that drug, and is it going to impact whether that drug is particularly effective or not in you. So we're already looking at personalized medicine, and Ayurveda, of course, is very personalized medicine. And so it's very interesting to see in the last 5 years or so how biomedical medicine is sort of coming closer and closer to some of the concepts in Ayurveda.
I was just talking to someone yesterday about this idea that when we learn Ayurveda, we learn about the 7 tissues, and we start to learn that, the body is like, it's this living system.
Mm-hmm.
And, when I was growing up, we would hear that if you smoked pot, right, you're going to kill brain cells and
right,
you're going to get dumber. Or this idea that the spinal tissue
mm-hmm.
regenerate. And so it's interesting that you've been studying that. Where are we now? And yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, I'm going to talk about that from a Ayurvedic perspective and a biomedical perspective, because you raise a really, really interesting issue for me. So when I was studying the 7 tissues, the 7 dhatus in Ayurveda, what really struck me was the concept of majja dhatu. And majja dhatu is really that which is encased in bone, and it includes the bone marrow and the central nervous system. And the bone marrow produces your red blood cells, but it also produces your white blood cells, your immune system. So 5,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago, the Ayurvedic physicians were grouping both the immune system and the nervous system as one functional tissue. Mm-hmm. And we are now, in sort of modern times, really appreciating the influence that the immune system has on the nervous system. and how inflammation, both in the periphery in your blood and in your brain, influences what we used to think of as just sort of psychiatric diseases that were neurotransmitter diseases like depression and anxiety and schizophrenia. In fact, I'm working on a review article sort of discussing these concepts right now. And inflammation really plays a large role in many of these diseases. So as a neuroscientist, and I'm trained as a neuroscientist, it's really interesting to me to see how the concept of the immune system and inflammation is really changing the way we think about the brain and the nervous system.
It's so fascinating. And, I thought you were going to say it the other way around, that the nervous system has such an impact on the immune system.
Well, it's mutual. It's both. It's both. The central nervous system can definitely influence the immune system, but it's a two-way street.
Mm-hmm.
And for a very long time, we thought that the nervous system was what was called immune privileged, meaning that immune cells and immune molecules didn't really influence the brain and the spinal cord very much. And we've done a complete 180, in the last 10 years in terms of how we think about that.
Right. So you're writing a review article on that, and I'd love to hear more about that. I feel like, so I'm so honored and so excited to be talking to you. And the more that I hear from you, the more I think I wish I could just go sit in your office and listen to how can people learn more about what you're looking at in this kind of research?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that there's been quite a lot in sort of the popular press in terms of inflammation and the role of inflammation in disease. And people are beginning to talk about that in terms of sort of psychiatric type diseases. So I think staying informed, if you don't want to read the original scientific literature, which can be kind of heavy, people are publishing books on the subject. Organizations like the Smithsonian and The Scientist is a magazine that's sort of geared towards a general audience. So, and just being aware of it and paying attention when people talk about inflammation and heart disease, inflammation and diabetes, inflammation and depression.
Mm-hmm.
Though it's really moving more and more into the mainstream.
Right. Brilliant. At the 2017 NAMA conference, I listened to you speak, and you talked about early research that was coming out. I don't think it had been published at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Out of either Australia or New Zealand, and it was something to do with daily application of sesame oil.
Yeah, so sesame oil has, people have looked at just plain sesame oil, and it has molecules in it that are anti-inflammatory. And what they do, there's a particular cellular pathway called NF-kappa beta in cells. And when that whole pathway gets activated, you get the production of what we call these pro-inflammatory cytokines. And those are sort of messengers that carry inflammation to tissues in your body. And sesame oil can inhibit that pathway. But people haven't really studied in detail how that might impact some of these diseases that we know inflammation plays a role in.
Right. And yet I thought that what that research was showing that it is daily application of sesame oil is impacting and beneficially impacting brain disorders. I think you mentioned maybe Alzheimer's or Parkinson's.
Those molecule, I don't know exactly. I think maybe the group that I know of in New Zealand and Australia are looking at Bacopa monnieri, which is the herb for memory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they're finding that is can be very beneficial in terms of Alzheimer's disease. And some of the work that's coming out of my own laboratory shows that Bacopa can inhibit some of these inflammatory molecules as well.
That's so great to know. And it's so available. We call it Brahmi, right?
Right. Well, Brahmi, that's interesting. So Brahmi,
Yeah.
sometimes people are referring to Bacopa monnieri when they talk about Brahmi, and sometimes they're referring to Centella asiatica, which is gotu kola. So Brahmi kind of covers both of those terms. But both of those herbs do have anti-inflammatory properties.
Right. Okay. Beautiful. I'm going to set links to these things so that people can find it, and I'll follow up with you for links.
Okay, yeah.
So is there any other research that you're working on now that you find exciting or you'd like to share with us?
Well, I think that, my own personal research looks at different extracts of plants and things like turmeric, curcumin and turmeric. And we look in a very sort of cell culture system, looking to see if they inhibit the production of some of these inflammatory molecules. What I find really interesting in terms of sort of just general biomedical science and how it links into Ayurveda is the whole concept of the microbiome. And how that has just exploded onto the scene in the last 5 years or so. And when I was studying Ayurveda, the two concepts that I really took away from that was the concept of inflammation and how important digestion and your gut is to health. And so it's fascinating to me to see how now Western, biomedical science is saying, well, the microbiome is really important in health. And everything goes in fashion in science. It's just like everything else. But now everybody's studying the microbiome for all kinds of diseases and syndromes. And so we're learning quite a lot about it. And it's really, really fascinating.
Really fascinating. Anything in particular? Anything that's...
What I think is really interesting is the integration of the microbiome and the central nervous system. I mean, it's not surprising to me that the microbiome would play a big role in things like irritable bowel syndrome or, some diseases of the digestive system. But we're beginning to see linkages between the nervous system and the gut. In terms of the microbiome, we know that molecules can travel from the gut to the brain through the vagus nerve, which is a peripheral nerve. And so I think we're just beginning to really understand how the whole body works in synergy. I think one of the things that I learned when I was doing my PhD, and we studied organ systems, and it was all sort of done in isolation. And the brain was kind of the master controller of everything. But I think now that we have a much greater appreciation in modern science as to how everything is integrated. And you can't really look at an organ system in isolation. So the immune system and the microbiome and all of these different systems are very closely intertwined. And so it isn't helpful to just look at something in isolation. I think that's really changing the way that we do our science and the way that we think about health. And Ayurveda has been saying that for, thousands of years.
It's an integrated system. That'll be interesting to see how it impacts the actual practice of medicine.
Right.
Because we have all these specialties based on the organs.
I know. And it takes a while because, when you have something that comes out in science, it takes like 10 or 15 years before it gets into clinical practice. Yeah. So it will be interesting to see how it goes.
I would imagine that's pretty revolutionary.
Yeah.
Do you remember, I think it was you who mentioned that turmeric might actually change once it gets into the bloodstream, and that's why we're not finding it?
Yeah, so this is really fascinating. And there's a paper that came out just recently about this, and we have a couple of scientists in my department who are studying this. So what they do is they grow the gut bacteria just in flasks, in a culture system. And when they put turmeric into that culture system and let the gut bacteria sort of digest it, what came out were some brand new compounds that you wouldn't normally see in the plant. So our gut microbiome is actually transforming what we eat and potentially creating new molecules. So there's a lot of work on turmeric. It's one of the most well-studied herbs. And one of the issues has been that it doesn't get we think the active ingredient is curcumin, but we don't see very much curcumin in the bloodstream or the brain after you ingest turmeric. We say that it's not very bioavailable.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's been a lot of work to try and increase more so that you have more curcumin in the blood, as you know, more is better. But it may be that we're not looking at the right molecules, that maybe it's these novel new compounds that are created by your gut bacteria that are really the ones that are benefiting your health.
It's the kind of thing where I just want to like do a happy dance when I hear that, because you hear so much about the bioavailability of turmeric.
Right.
And so then now we have to put black pepper. If we're gonna have turmeric, we have to have black pepper with it. And then,
Yeah.
okay, Ayurveda has had black pepper with their turmeric, but not always, And so it's made me, when you said that, I thought, aha, like that just seems so intelligent.
Well, and it's really interesting because, especially in the United States, we always think more is better.
Right.
And when you look at the toxicology literature, so I've done some work in lead toxicity and how lead affects the development of the nervous system. You get two different effects of lead depending on whether you're at a very low dose, because at low doses it tends to bind to DNA and change how your DNA is transcribed. And at high doses, it substitutes for other compounds like calcium in your body and has a whole different series of effects. So I like to think about the herbs as you don't necessarily need a lot of them. They may be very effective at low doses, but they have a different sort of mechanism of action at a low dose than they do at a high dose.
Right. It's just like the body is even more intelligent than we are.
Yes.
All due respect to all the science and all the research, the body still seems like it's ahead of us.
Right. Yeah. And so when I teach an Ayurvedic class for pharmacy students, and they're always asking me, well, how much herbs should I take, or how many spices? And, honestly, for sort of wellness and day to day, I think you should just cook with them.
Yeah.
There's no specific dose. You don't need to take 5 pounds of turmeric a day. You just add these herbs and spices into your cooking.
Mm-hmm.
Because plants have an enormous number of constituents.
Mm-hmm.
And I think science is beginning to appreciate now that you're not going to be able to pick out one component and that's going to be the magic bullet.
Right.
It's all the different compounds that are in a plant and how they sort of interact together that's important.
So that reminds me of what you just said about organ-specific medicine versus the wholeness of the body.
Mm-hmm.
Same is true of the food.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
the wholeness and not just the isolates.
Yeah.
That's great advice for people. So that with all that we're saying about the benefits of these spices and these herbs,
Mm-hmm.
people can stay relaxed. All we need to do is cook it into our foods.
Absolutely. We obsess way too much about our food and our diet in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And my experience with my college age students and older students is that most people don't really cook with very many spices. Salt and pepper, maybe some cinnamon.
Right.
And one of the things that I try and encourage people is to get some recipes with different herbs and spices, to experiment a little bit with them and see what they like.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the majority of people that I encounter, in Montana at least, they don't cook with a lot of spices.
Yeah.
Maybe basil, maybe.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be Indians, spices from India.
Mm-hmm.
Using our local herbs is excellent.
Right. That's great advice. So then would you say that people should just experiment and see what go according to their own taste?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's really the secret of Ayurveda, is that it teaches you to pay attention to your body. How do you feel after you eat? How do you feel after you exercise? I think we live, especially now, so externally.
Yes.
We're always living outside of ourselves. There's always stimulation. There's always something going on. And we never think about how we feel.
Mm-hmm.
That's always sort of glossed over.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think one of the things that my students really take away from the class is learning to pay attention to how they feel.
So beautiful. In this world that is so focused on science,
Hmm.
to verify experience. I think that people have really lost that. We keep
Yes.
we are bombarded by science, and so we start to say, well, what does the science tell us to do?
Hmm. Right.
And then I like to think, well, a lot of those scientists are pitta. They might not even be your dosha.
Exactly.
Not, but it's we. I love what you're saying, because I think we do need to come back to our own knowing
Yes.
and knowing for ourselves. It's
Yeah.
beautiful. Just a couple of final questions. When you talked about in the beginning the dosha and personalized medicine, do you
Hmm.
think that actually Western medicine might help us specify doshas and how we determine doshas?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because we're beginning to look at dosha and then do genetic analysis to see, are there genes that are associated with a particular dosha. And there's some interesting studies coming out of India and the US looking at that.
Mhm.
I think one of our issues as an Ayurvedic community that we are going to have to deal with is how we assess dosha.
Mhm.
So when we do these studies in a scientific way, we're going to have a fairly well established way to identify dosha, so that these studies can you can look at all the different studies and say we analyze dosha in a very similar way.
Right.
So that's something that we need to work on, is having sort of a standardized dosha analysis that we can use for these scientific studies, not necessarily for practice, but something when we're looking at a genetic analysis or disease predisposition.
Mhm. It's difficult because it's you're talking about something that's so comprehensive. It has so many
Yes,
aspects to it.
yes,
But I think it would
yeah.
help with some of the confusion that's out there in the world too. I think
Mhm.
I find that people are often telling me, I don't know what my dosha is.
Yes.
And
Or they say this one person said I was this and this one person said I was that.
right,
Yeah.
not just different tests or different quizzes that we have on the
Right.
but different doctors saying different things.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, beautiful. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much. Is there any last thing that you'd like to share, or any tips for people who are watching? Just something they can do daily or now?
Well, I think that paying attention to how you feel after things is very important.
Mhm.
And I think educating yourself about how the body works is really very important. I was just looking at an article that was saying that most people don't really have a good understanding of biology and how what health is and how what diseases are.
Mm.
So you don't have to, become an expert, but I think educating yourself is really important. I think the days of going to a physician and having them just tell you what to do are gone,
Right.
because there's so much knowledge out there. You have to be an informed and educated person.
Mhm.
So I think that's very, very important, that you have to be in charge of your own health. And to do that, you have to educate yourself a little bit about how the body works.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
And you have done so much to help educate people, not only by doing the research, but then reviewing and writing articles. You've been the editor in chief of the Ayurveda Journal.
Right.
So I'll also put a link to that for people who do want to.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the Ayurveda Journal of Health. Yes, it's our only peer-reviewed journal in the United States, and we publish a whole variety of articles. So we have recipes, we have commentaries, we have research, we have interviews.
Right,
So it really covers the whole spectrum of Ayurveda.
right. It's really so excellent. Thank you so much for all that you do. You
Well,
have,
thank you.
I feel like you've been sent here from heaven or from Ra.
I don't know about that.
You're an incarnation of one of these. You really have done. You are doing so much to advance Ayurvedic science in the West, and
Well, thank
that
you.
is going to be so beneficial to untold numbers of people. So thank you for your
Thank you. All
beautiful.
right.
Thanks, Diane.
Bye-bye.